Good morning to everyone. My name is Börje Ljunggren. I'm a senior associate here at the Institute and also happen to be the coordinator of the Stockholm China Forum. And like Lars Fredén here, former ambassador to China. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all. I think it's bound to be a very exciting seminar. A word about the background to this event. 70 years ago, the Marshall Plan was launched on the 5th of June. And 25 years later, Germany, in recognition of what had been achieved, made a donation to establish the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It's an American foundation. The purpose, of course, to promote closer transatlantic relations. Then, over the years, the notions of the dialogue got wider and wider, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall and so forth, and in the year 2006, the GMF asked our foreign ministry whether we were interested in launching a Stockholm China Forum, and that was agreed. And to do that in collaboration with some other research foundations, and to involve both the American side, the European side, and of course distinguished Chinese participants, and do this so according to the Chatham House rules, second tier you may say, with the GMF as the organizer. And today, today and tomorrow, the 18th such forum will take place. So it's the 10th anniversary in Salzburg, and on this occasion we have had the opportunity then to ask some of the most distinguished participants, there are 60 or so in all, to join us here this morning to discuss the subject that you have come here to explore. And let me first present the four speakers. Here we have first Bonnie Glaser, Senior Advisor for Asia, Director, China Power Project at CSIS in Washington. I think you have been attending most of our meetings over the years. And François Goudemont, now the Director of the Asia Program with the European Council on Foreign Relations. For many years at Sciences Po in France. And I think I would dare say the leading European scholar when it comes to China. Xi Jinping, our Chinese friend. What happened to
Somewhere.
him?
We saw him.
Right. You have to imagine him. Professor of International Relations, and Director for the Center for American Studies at Renmin University. Here he is. You have also already been introduced.
It's perfect time.
And a truly appreciated member of the core group of this Stockholm China Forum. And then Orville Schell, finally, Director of the Center for US-China Relations at the Asia Society in New York. His most recent book, we have talked about that, Wealth and Power, China's Long March towards the 21st Century. I thought it was a great book. And then we have Björn Gerdén, head of Asia here at the Institute, who will also comment later. Simply, what can you more demand than have such a panel this very morning? Trump and the rising China. I'd like to open the seminar by posing two questions. How would you describe the current state of Sino-US relations? And how do you expect the relationship to develop during the Trump administration? Second, how do you look upon the longer-term prospects? In his recent book, quote, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? Graham Allison is saying that China and the US, they are on collision course for war, unless both parties take difficult and painful actions to avert. What's your assessment? Each speaker will have 10 minutes to comment on these two questions, and of course any other issue they might like to add, and then Björn will make some comment, and then the floor will be open for question and discussion. So please, Bonnie, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador, and it's a privilege to be here at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs. So we each have 10 minutes, and I will try to be concise. I'm going to address the second question first, and fairly briefly. Graham Allison is not really the first person to predict that there might be a US-China war. In the field of political science, we have John Mearsheimer, who's of the offensive realist school, who has been predicting this due to the structural basis of US-China relations, the rising power power and the established power, the power transition theory, that eventually there will be a war. My own view is that war is not inevitable, that a conflict is neither in U.S. nor China's interests. And we can see many actions taken by both the United States and China to avoid war. And I would cite, for example, a memorandum of understanding that was signed last year by the U.S. and China to try and avoid accidents at sea and in the air and the maritime spaces where China's vessels and aircraft are operating in close proximity to those of the United States. And I want to spend a little bit more time talking about this first question of the state of U.S.-China relations and its likely future. The U.S.-China relationship is far better than many of us expected. During the presidential campaign, there were threats by then-candidate Trump to impose 45% tariffs on China, label China a currency manipulator on day one. We did not know at that time that he would decide to make cooperation on North Korea the litmus test of the U.S.-China relationship. And that is indeed what has happened. And it's an interesting evolution. You know, President Obama sat down with Trump and said, this will be the biggest national security challenge that you face. And then after intelligence briefings, Trump himself became convinced. It's important for the U.S.-China relationship for many reasons, not only because North Korea is close to posing an existential threat to the United States with the potential of putting a nuclear weapon on a missile that could be delivered to the U.S., but it's also because there's really an absence of issues now that the U.S. and China can cooperate on. The Obama administration recognized very early you have to expand the areas of cooperation in order to cushion some of these growing areas of friction. And of course, we know climate change was an area that both countries worked together on very well. Also, the Iran nuclear agreement. So these issues are now no longer in the cooperation box because of changes in Trump administration policy. And so there really is a need to find other things to cooperate on. North Korea does pose that potential. That said, I expect the U.S.-China relationship to deteriorate, even though right now it is stable and somewhat positive. I see it as fragile. And on the 21st of this month, we will have the first meeting, or actually the second, since the first really took place at the Mar-a-Lago summit between Xi Jinping and President Trump. So it's the second meeting of a part of the new dialogue mechanism between the U.S. and China. It's called the Diplomatic and Security Dialogue. And so they will talk about many things, but one of them will be North Korea. There's already indications of growing frustration in the Trump administration that China is not doing enough to put pressure on North Korea. It's not shutting down those companies that are facilitating North Korea's access to the international financial system through money laundering. It's not willing to cut off crude oil exports to North Korea. The recent UN Security Council resolution was really quite tame, very, very limited. Another area is South China Sea. Many of you may know that China built 7 artificial islands in the Spratly Island chain in the South China Sea during the Obama administration. 3 of them have very long runways and other military capabilities. And as I understand it, the Chinese are going to soon start operating out of those facilities. And I think that will cause friction between the U.S. and China. And then the final thing that I will mention is trade. Although there has been a 100-day deal, the elements in those deals are very small. They're really low-hanging fruit. There is a lot of there are a lot of problems in the trade and economic relationships. Some of them relating to China's plan of 2025, making more indigenous sources of innovation, and this is all, of course, at the expense of foreign companies. So I think those 3 issue areas are likely to cause more tension in the relationship, which, of course, is only against the background of the inherent structural competition between a rising power and an established power. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So just a quick question. So what will the situation look like 1 year from now?
1 year from now. I think that we will be seeing more attention on all three of those issues. So we will continue. Perhaps we will have President Trump visiting China this fall, and so it will be interesting to see whether that results in greater ability to manage those issues or if the relationship deteriorates. I personally think it will deteriorate. Part of the reason is to manage this relationship, you must have wise and capable leadership. This is really important, and that's a factor that I think I have a big question mark on.
Shared by many. So, Xi Jinping, please, go second.
Yeah, I think that generally you are familiar with the Sino-American relations in the most recent years, and I will focus first on China's strategic policy. And since 18th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping talked about power until most recently, exactly speaking, until the middle or later of last year, and strategic policy of Xi Jinping, and especially East Asia and Western Pacific, has been characterized by strategic assertiveness. And China and Trump declared boost its strategic military forces, and to let something just like the Sino-American arms race over the Western Pacific, and also China take a very vigorous action to expand extend all its strategic activity, and China engage in the very severe military confrontation with Japan and China, and do a lot of things to strengthen China's military, position of strength in South China Sea, and so on and so on. And of course, the results is positive and negative to China, and roughly speaking, and Xi Jinping's actions and taken at the past 4 or 5 years, and greatly strengthened China's hard power, but also and maybe relatively weaken China's international soft power, and especially to make China's relationship with Japan, with Southeast Asian countries become much more complicated, and also raise the threat or risk of military conflict with Japan and elastically with the United States. And so, and the double effects. And toward the middle of last year, and the two domestic situations become more clear, and because China's economic growth and have turned to some slow but adamantly, go down, and China's financial risks was increasingly, the bigger. And then I think that around the beginning of the G20 Hangzhou summit, and China, Xi Jinping have begun to moderate in some degree its posture in South China Sea, but still, and China's moderation is limited. Then, and came Trump as a tipping point. And at first, if China take great attention to Trump's very threatening and statements and some deeds during campaign and in the first months of Trump's presidency, and China have a great fear that Trump might damage China's economic finance severely. And and at that time, Xi Jinping take such kind of approach to dealing with Trump, and characterized by extreme patience. And I never seen Xi Jinping and was so patient toward anyone. And but soon, and the second that China, and not only quite prudent in dealing with Trump, but also to launch a very intensive work to find which one is good guy, relatively good guy within Trump team. And China soon found it. And most important is Trump's son-in-law. And so Beijing and take a very patient work and deal with Trump team, and then have results. And overnight Trump and changed its position and threatened position over Taiwan, and endorsed the American traditional one China policy. And then and Xi Jinping and Trump make a summit in Florida, and the excellence of the atmosphere of summit, and was almost surprising to China ourselves. And Trump is extremely nice, and only asked two concessions. One is over North Korea, another is over trade, and focus on North Korea. And so I think that it encouraged and Xi Jinping greatly that China could manage Trump relatively easily. So Xi Jinping and take a few major actions and in sanctioning North Korea, which China's previous leaders was never willing or never dared to take. And also China and proposed a so-called 100-day, the plan to increase and up to now approved in a limited degree and American export to China. And Trump's attitude since then toward China is very nice. He almost, he even lavishly appraised Xi Jinping several times. And this kind of the behavior greatly encouraged China and his confidence, Xi Jinping's confidence that to manage Trump and is relatively easy. It's quite easy, especially in taking into account Trump's severely domestic political difficulties. And China seems already have a confidence that in a bright future, and within a year maybe, and Trump dare not to spoil and Sino-American relationship because his domestic political difficulties, because his lack of any major domestic international achievements. And also, and I would like to emphasize that during this period, and almost suddenly, and Xi Jinping's strategic policy, especially in East Asia and Western Pacific, and have and to show that the emerging comprehensive indications of moderation. And the China and moderate its behavior over South China Sea. And China and taking into the chance of South Korea's new president and try to try to improve the relation with Seoul, and which has been damaged very much by Seoul's previous decision to deploy THAAD defense, the missile defense system, and by China's so-called comprehensive informal sanctions against AOK. And most importantly, that during recent weeks and at most months, and both Tokyo and Beijing and show serious and major indications that they both want to substantially improve the bilateral relationship and trying to realize the formal state visit and by Xi Jinping or Shinzo Abe and in the next year. And also China's and the dialogue with maritime South ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries become more serious. So maybe this is a chance. And you can find that, especially in terms of strategic and policy, and Xi Jinping almost now just begin to have its second major round after the 18th Party Congress. But there are still great uncertainties. And uncertainty on the part of Trump. And because his domestic political situation is very weak, so and it's not altogether impossible that someday he will and take a harder policy against China, especially on trade front, and also within Trump administration, and there are strategic hardliners, especially Secretary of Defense Modis, and who have a very good relation with Japan and AOK. And maybe in less degree, and also prominent Vice President Pence. And also, even before Trump took over power in White House, and U.S. strategic opinion within the strategic side have already become almost overwhelmingly, strategic hardline toward China. On Chinese side, and we, including my personal, frankly speaking, and we use it to a very aggressive and assertive Xi Jinping. And since autumn of 2012 and to just several months ago. So I'm not sure whether our Supreme Commander patience and moderation this time is really for a long time. So many things is still uncertain. But most of all, I think that the situational condition could be changed. But if you look at the structural elements, especially in strategic and military field, between the United States and China, I think a strategic rivalry, objectively speaking, between Washington and Beijing has steadily become more comprehensive and more profound. And up to now, no solution to deal with those bilateral strategic rivalries. What we have hope is only to stabilize the situation, not to let the rivalry become more deteriorated into some possible confrontation or even conflict. And so I think that if you take a whole picture, and Sino-American relationship, or China's strategic posture toward East Asia and Western Pacific, maybe now we have a relatively best time, and in the past 5 years, but still, and we could have, possible situation that it will reverse to old track, and especially like since during the later half of Obama administration. And so I think that much depends on how China and the US and other Asian countries' top leadership to deal with the situation. And I think that we have a little bigger, a greater hope than any time and in the past 5 years, but we still have not sufficient confidence and to believe that the situation in East Asia and Western Pacific could become steadily more peaceful and more, lack of rivalry and confrontation, and because so many factors still is and seems take a long time negative track. Thank you.
Thank you, Xinong. Is it fair to say that what you mean is that the structural rivalry that you talk about will get more serious over time?
Yeah, I think that refer to the second part of the time. I think that if we take so-called the history analogy and to look at more than 2,000 years ago between Athens and Sparta, and you found that the conflict, final conflict, come from process as long as 30 years. During these 30 years, and many things happen, and sometimes situation is quite good. Sometimes within Athens and within Sparta, so-called peaceful faction are in domestic political preference. But other times, and situations are different. And most important thing, I'm a somewhat historian. You look at 2,000 years ago, and Sparta generally always and respect Athens. Athens always, almost, and respect Sparta. What's the problem is that the so-called strategic space between them, and especially Athens, and during about 10 years before the outbreak of the major conflict, Athens continue to take so-called punitive actions to punish some Sparta's kingship city-states or Sparta's allies. And this kind of action, I think, is most immediate and important causes for the outbreak of major conflict. And so I think that China should learn from lessons. And Sparta is a last word. Sparta is sometimes maybe like the United States today, is a lazy superpower and always delay to define the bottom line. But finally, and Sparta thinks that it cannot tolerate further, especially under the framing, agitation of Collins. And you can think that maybe it could be Japan in today. So I think that to avoid superpower conflict is not easy because it depends on efforts and during decades. And sometimes great powers can pass over one crisis after another. But finally, in the past, they have not passed the final crisis.
Okay, that was a dramatic way of ending. So François, please.
Thank you very much to the Institute for giving us this opportunity. No thanks at all to my friend Borges for asking those tough questions. In fact, it's tougher than ever. Usually, you can say that on the one side you have a rather predictable democracy, which is where it's not too difficult to look at intentions, and sometimes it's predictably disappointing, and people can talk about a cycle, a policy cycle on China. The people who look it closely have watched it several times. On the other side, you usually have, with China, a partner who, above all, seeks stability and predictability, but who likes to spring surprises by itself. And it's the mix of the two that creates the momentum, let's say, for one term of a US administration. This time we have a president who has at least fulfilled one major campaign promise, which was to be unpredictable regarding China. And I think we're all struggling, of course, for clues. We find clues, but not necessarily in the same direction, and we realize it can change. While we have a China which, and I concur with some of what has been said with Bonnie and also with what has been said with Ying-Hong, a China that has become cautious, patient, trying to perhaps to go beyond the present interval, if I was going to use a strong word, to survive the present interval, although that would not be accurate. It's an unusual situation. One side, if I was going to compare it to a boxing match, if you remember Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali. Cassius Clay, the sedate, massive, apparently slow-moving but very dangerous boxer, and Muhammad Ali, the butterfly, dancing around his adversary. I think each of those two leaders sees himself in one of those two roles, and you can guess who is who in that game. But we have to overcome, how should I say, our ideological prejudices. Right now we look more at the US and we look more at the court in the White House and around the White House and at the risks, and we are dismayed by what is happening. Whereas China does its best, it's at a moment when the paramount leader is gathering more authority than ever since the death of Mao, and in fact way before that death, and is therefore fascinating us. You look at a lot of the media hype is about China actually replacing the US as a leader of the multilateral order, or alternatively as a guarantor of the multilateral, of the multilateral order. That's of course going way too far. Let's look at the relationship now. What is striking to me, and I concur with Ying-Hong, is that China has indeed taken the incoming administration much more seriously than probably anybody else except Japan. And not by accident is it Japan that has also taken the administration seriously. You go to China, you hear absolutely nothing of what you hear around here in Europe. Officially, there are no snipes, no personal issues. There is even admiration at a strong person still remaining in the press. And there is, I think, a fascination with what is happening in the US, very much in the other direction from the predominant feelings in Europe. This means that China has adjusted quite quickly its behavior in several areas, and that I concur with Bonnie. South China Sea, which was the leading candidate for incidents, the last real meaningful stuff was capturing a submarine drone near the Filipinos, but that was in the waning weeks of the Obama administration. Since that, we have an aerial incident, but the consensus, which, by the way, Chinese analysts are trying to propagate by themselves, is that China has now paused or moderated or shifted perhaps to one belt, one road its external ambitions. It's going to take a lot of time to distinguish between what could be a lull, a mere temporary stop, which has happened in the past, and a longer stop. That is evident. In an area which preoccupies Europe a lot, which is economic diplomacy because of trade issues, fascinating that Europe got away during that short interval with denying market economy status and preparing trade defense instruments, which would have brought a very strong Chinese response. But for a few months, China was nowhere to be seen because it feared what Bonnie has described as the campaign promises on border tax and so on. We are now, as we speak, already in a second phase where China is somewhat reassured by the first deals in the 100-day period that we have heard about. Even though those deals are very limited, they indicate that there may be room for more. And since China's primary fear, indeed, is avoiding an economic conflict that would cost it dearly, the pressure is still on in that area. However, the little that I know about the US administration being much farther away than Bonnie, for example, from DC, is that this is not likely to last. A, because China is not really delivering. B, because on Korea I would be even more sanguine than she has been on the mirage of a Chinese solution to North Korea. It's not happening, and it's not likely to happen. There may be nothing to trade, nothing to link, in fact. And therefore we are going to be back to other issues. Third, because if we go beyond the superficial impression we have about the top of the present US administration, behind it is a cadre of fairly experienced, fairly conservative, fairly realist people who have track records and who are doing their best to create longer-lasting policies. And if nothing happens, for example, on the trade and economic front, what was the president's main real campaign promise will be seen to have fallen through. The same applies to South China Sea issue, and I'm a bit reluctant to enter the is there a coming war or not, because nobody does very well at those predictions. I was a fan of Thucydides when I was a youngster because I was raised on it, but I wouldn't go back to Hellenic days today. I would go back to the 20s and 30s. In the 20s, the Western dream, Anglo-American, about the Pacific was to create a stabilization of forces, to freeze what was happening, where you clearly had a rising Japan, but to come to an agreement to say, okay, we'll stop there. And it never worked. It never worked because you had the country rising and because Japan itself was hovering. Conflict can happen in three ways. Given the fact that there is still a huge asymmetry of forces with, if you count not only the US, but the US plus Japan, China is still, by all counts, the underdog on any one of those grounds. Conflict can happen, as Bonnie has alluded to, because there is a local miscalculation, local accident that is allowed to escalate. I don't believe this is very likely. Because China, it's not that China is not aggressive, it is aggressive, but it has a remarkable track record of picking its fights and a remarkable track record of avoiding any situation where it might be forced to escalate. It is almost guaranteed to prevent that type of situation. The second thing that might happen is if there is a strategic miscalculation by China. That can only happen if we have a very, very clear political weakening of the US. That is, if the debate in China between people who think the US decline is slow and those who think that it's fast, that's essentially how they see it. There's unfortunately for the US no third option right now in how they view, they may be wrong, by the way, and have been proven to be wrong in the past, but that's how they think. So there would need to be such visible signs of disarray that suddenly, an option could move forward. And historically, we even have the example of Japan, where, Japan's admirals pushed for a while, knowing that they would lose it. It's an extraordinary case, but it's possible, it happens. And the third case, about which no one ever thinks of, is if another party decides that while it enjoys maybe your temporary or partial superiority, it's got to test China to make it move back. And that's equally possible if China decides to go beyond red lines. It has already gone beyond the red line on Scarborough Shoal. I think that's the one area where it has gone further than any warning or any self-accepted limitation. But there are others. There are some in the Senkaku. There are some farther ahead in the South China Sea with, let's say, for example, a country like Malaysia, which is literally submersed with Chinese investment and money. So you might think, if you're in Beijing, that you can get away with crossing the red line because the country is under control anyway, and you make a mistake. These things are possible, and I think we should remain careful in our prognosis. Since I believe with you, we're the two Europeans on the panel, I'll say just a bit and stop there, but about the position of Europe. I would say first, discount all the media hype about we're closer to China for reasons of multilateralism, the climate stuff, the Trump, the unilateralist, or not even unilateralist, but the guy who is breaking all rules and destroying the liberal order, and therefore we're closer to China. There is literally no substance for that. However, there are triangular issues at times. And one problem that I see is that if we see that we still rely on the United States and we need the United States, and therefore there is quid pro quo and linkage, and we have to support the US on Asia issues very often. In the other direction, it's completely possible that some at the top of the US think of all these issues one by one. There's many quid pro quo for Europe. I'm looking at the trade situation, the trade and investment situation, and waiting to see what will happen, because it's possible, just possible, that if the US is too erratic or doesn't know how to pick its enemies, so to speak, or its targets, it's just possible that Europe would retreat in the shadow, trying just to outlive the difficulties between the US and China. And that would already be a very big result for China, in fact, which is not kidding itself that it can bring us in. I'll just end with one note. As you know, the EU-China summit failed to produce a communique when Europeans thought, when the Commission, the EES, thought they would have one. My belief is the reason we don't have a communique on climate is that the Chinese wanted to indicate to Washington that they are still the primary game in town, that they were not going to go and use the satisfaction of saying we're with Europe and Europe is with us on what they consider a totally minor issue, I'm sorry to say, climate. They much prefer giving to Washington the impression that they are dealing with it and waiting probably rather anxiously for US policy to stabilize. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. And all this happening, obviously, while a power shift is occurring. So it's a very complex situation. Orville, please.
Well, thank you to the Institute for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. There was an expression that Chairman Mao was fond of using, and that is to rebel is justified. 造反有理 in Chinese. We've come to a very paradoxical and strange circumstance where it is no longer, I think as Francois has suggested, China, which is the uncertainty principle in its relationships with major other powers. It is now my own country. In a certain sense, I think there are many striking comparisons between Donald Trump and Mao Zedong. And both of them have this sort of notion of that destruction is a form of creativity. And unpredictability has its virtues. And indeed, in certain ways, it does. Because there's nothing China likes more than to push, you back up, it pushes again, you back up, and on and on and on and on and on. Europe has certainly had some experience in that category of international relation. Trump got their attention in that regard. I think the thing that alarms me, and I'm not going to go through all the sort of actual concrete issues which my colleagues did, are sort of the issues and the forces that lurk behind the curtain of this very important relation between the U.S. and China. We've lost climate change. Francois doesn't think it's worth that much, but
To China. To us, it's worth more.
Well, it's worth something to us, maybe not to China. But it was, in fact, sort of the keystone of the U.S.-China arch in the sense that it was an area after a good deal of struggle where we got along. It was the one area where we finally had found some common interest. Now, it's conceivable, but I think only barely so, that North Korea could come to play that role. I don't frankly think trade is worth that much as a common interest. It didn't stop World War I, it didn't stop World War II. I really don't think it's gonna, that's a very thick reed to lean on. Possibly, if Xi Jinping is smart, he'll think this guy Trump has got nothing to show for all of his efforts. He needs a deal. Let's give him a deal. Let's team up on North Korea, and this could be our new kind of partnership. I share Francois's sort of circumspection and doubtfulness about whether that will actually come to happen, but it could. So this means we have a relationship that is, on the one hand, the poles between the troublemaker and constancy have been reversed, where we have no real common obvious chord or one issue where we're actually getting along pretty well. We're left with lots of areas of tension. Now, in my view, to make things even a little more problematic, there are two other things that we really don't like to talk about that much in foreign relations. But for me, I think they're so paramount. The first is this. When we began, and I speak as an American, this whole venture, this odyssey with China back in 1972 with Nixon and Kissinger, the presumption was that if we just have more exchange, diplomatic relations, trade, few more ballet companies, symphony orchestras, more academic exchanges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we will get ourselves on a kind of common teleology. In other words, our histories will be sort of flowing towards the same goals in the same direction. And this went along quite merrily, where we actually believed, perhaps naively, that some economic reform would lead to political reform, that China in the end would open up. This is the long-time American evangelical dream. And then what happened? 1989. The end of that sort of sense of historical common purpose. Now, Jiang Zemin revived it a bit, I have to say, in the 90s. And I remember going to China with President Clinton. And I remember one of the most extraordinary press conferences between him and Jiang Zemin in the Great Hall of the People, sitting there with these two men. They were like two performers in a nightclub. You had the sense from Jiang Zemin he wanted to be a normal leader. And he was ad-libbing with Clinton. And they got off into a territory. I remember at one point, Jiang Zemin asked Clinton, he said, you know, I really don't understand why it is that Americans, this modern scientific country, are so fascinated with what he called Lama Jiao, in other words, Tibetan Buddhism. This is stunning. And Clinton got going. And Jiang Zemin got very frightened. Now, I mention all this not only because it's an interesting anecdote, but because it suggests a level of concord, a level of common purpose, a level of leadership. Two leaders, above all, enjoying each other's company and sort of taking a certain pleasure in a repartee. And then Jiang Zemin said, well, with the president's permission, perhaps we'll end here. Clinton was having none of it. And he went on and he said, no, Mr. Jiang, I won't tell you, I think if you had a chance to meet the Dalai Lama, you'd really like him. Well, we were off to the races. But this I raise only by recognizing the fact that there was a time when these two countries kind of interacted in a more human, a more effective, and a more personal way. Now, why am I telling you this? Because we're not doing that now. And why are we not doing that now? Well, we don't have time to get into it in great detail. It's because Xi Jinping, as a leader, is a very different man. Doesn't pretend to speak English, doesn't sing Solo Mio in Italian, can't recite the Gettysburg Address, doesn't really reveal much, isn't really interested in having a personal relation with anybody on our side, as so far as we can see. And this bespeaks of an even larger and more sort of, I think, difficult specter lurking behind the curtain. Namely, we have absolutely antithetical, and I say this to you, Swedes, political systems and values. And this is the radioactive core sort of pulsing behind all of our efforts to get along. And it is emitting rather toxic waves of radiation, in my view, which make it very, very difficult for us to engage in the kind of trust that is fundamental to leaders coming to some sort of understanding and a deal. And we don't know how to talk about this. We don't know what to do with this. Our histories are now going in opposite directions. Xi Jinping has said indelibly, clearly, emphatically, we are not going in the same direction as you. We do not want to get where you are. Moreover, we take one look at what's happening in Washington. We don't want to be there. But they are on their own teleological path where God only knows. But it certainly isn't the direction that Americans, and I think many of you in Europe once imagined, that with a little more EU aid, a little more humanism, a little more this and a little more that, we'd all get there together. That doesn't seem to be happening now. So these things, in my view, are sort of hovering over us and making it very difficult for us to arrive at any kind of common understandings and deals, because we view ourselves as headed in different directions with different systems, with different values that have a fundamental antagonism. And it is no accident that if you read things in Chinese now, you're seeing again and again and again references to things like hostile foreign forces, the sort of innate Chinese paranoia that the Western democracies are out to get China, out to change its system. Chinese call it 和平演变, peaceful evolution. You may think, charming. Isn't that the perfect scenario? Slowly, peacefully, without violence, we will get to some new and higher state of development. It's Karl Marx, for heaven's sakes. It's Hegel. It's all of these wonderful people we've grown up on. No, that's not what's happening. That is not where Xi Jinping is going. And I think we should take note of it. And what we do with it is another question of how do you finally get along with, I think there are ways, but it takes a radical recombination of the way we look at China. Are we willing to say, good, nice dictatorship, nice authoritarian country, nice Leninist capitalist country, you lock them up, no problem, not our business, we're not our brother's keeper, let's do trade, let's work out climate change, let's stop North Korea from blowing up the world. These are higher magnitude issues. Are we ready to do that? I don't think we've even asked ourselves the question. Maybe we're at that point. I think that's sort of what China would like. So we've arrived, I think, in my view, at a place where the issues, the wager is completely new and different. And alas, we confront this brave new world with a man in the White House who can't remember what he did yesterday. I don't mean to say that in any, this is just a simple recognition of the fact. I don't think there's much of a strategy there. There's some good people in Washington working for him, but I don't think there's any great visionary leadership. So what are we to do? Turn it over to Xi Jinping? Give him the helm? You're the new leader? You're the new adult in the room? You are a model? I don't know. So I feel we're at a historical tipping point of some great magnitude, and I'm not sure how we get out of it or what the best thing for us to do is. But I do think we have to recognize with some very fundamental things about what's important in our way of life and how we best protect that and factor that into our foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. An invitation to quite a discussion, but we'll have to move on, and now Björn will make his comments, reflections. Please.
Yeah, well, that was 4 excellent presentations, really. I have a lot of questions, but I think I try to limit myself to 1 question per presenter, and then we can leave it to the floor for Q&A. So I start in the order you presented. Bonnie first. I would like to ask you a little bit more about the trade component of the relationship. During his campaign, Donald Trump, of course, presented China as a boogeyman. And I think when it came to the state of the American economy, and I think what was stark was that all his predecessors presented China joining the global economy as an engine of globalization, as a fundamentally good thing for the world at large, for China, but also for America. Whereas Trump instead blamed China joining the world economy for America's economic woes. And Trump, of course, is a populist. And populists are sensitive to not when they get into power, to not showing results on these kind of populist issues. So it seems to me that this trade issue won't really go away that easily, because it's such a central component of Trump's thinking about how to revitalize the American economy. So I would like to ask you a little bit more, how might this play out in the autumn and in the coming years? What concrete measures can we expect from the Trump administration, and how will this affect the relationship with China? And move on to In-Hong. Bonnie too, of course, mentioned the issue about North Korea as, well, it has turned into a litmus test for the American side for China to show its goodwill for this relationship. And what Trump and his administration are trying to do is to get China on board to push North Korea harder. So my question to you first, is this likely to succeed? How far is Xi willing to go here? And what Trump is trying to do, is he trying through his tweeting and through his statements to say that, look at North Koreans, they make China lose face, right? They make China's highly respected leader lose face. And of course there are some people also within China who had it with North Korea's behavior. So will this strategy to push China harder, to push North Korea, work? And if so, might this succeed in changing North Korea's behavior in any way? Does China really have that much leverage over North Korea? And Francois, you ended by mentioning something about the relationship between Europe and China, and you criticized this sort of media narrative that emerged after Xi Jinping's speech in Davos at the World Economic Forum, where he presented China as the adult in the room and sort of the steadfast guarantor of globalization and efforts to combat climate change and so on. And you argue that, well, really, if you look at the actual multilateral issues, there's, well, the Chinese and us Europeans, we don't really see eye to eye on many issues. But I would like to ask still, so how in this new situation, since Trump came to power, what can we do in Europe to influence China here? also moving beyond climate change, is it possible for us in some way to influence China's behavior in a way that we like it to develop, or do we not really have that much influence over these issues, and sort of will we just retreat into the background and until the US-China relationship stabilize, if it will, or can we really play a role here, and if so, how can we achieve it? Orville, it's sort of a fairly pessimistic view that you present here. And of course, these political systems in China and the US, there is a big contradiction there. You can't avoid it. You can't pretend that it doesn't exist. And of course, those people who believed that engaging China, trading with China, sending musicians to China and academics and so on would make China democratic and liberal, they were wrong. Obviously, we got the facts now. But still, is this situation really new? You describe it as a tipping point because, well, at least since 1989, I think it's been clear to many people that China's trajectory is not preordained toward a liberal future. So in that sense, these two contradictory political systems have coexisted for several decades now. And what is different now, right? If it sort of worked so far, okay, for most of the time, what speaks against that it will continue to do so in the future? So thank you much again for excellent presentations. I look forward to hearing your...
Great questions, rather huge, I might say. But still, could you comment on each one of them very, very briefly, and then we turn to the floor.
How much time do we have?
You have 2 exact minutes.
2 minutes, okay, all right. So in your question, I think you suggested that Trump is different from prior presidents in that he has not supported China's integration into the world economy. I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. I don't think Trump has a problem with China being an active part of the economy. It is the fact that the bilateral economic relationship has been, from Trump's perspective, to the advantage of China and the disadvantage of the United States. So we have a president who's very focused on America first, and particularly in the economic realm on bilateral trade deficits. So when we see this not only with China, of course our biggest bilateral trade deficit is with China, but this is an issue in our relationship with Germany, our relationship with Vietnam, who is our number 6 bilateral deficit country. In the Obama administration, the conversation was almost entirely on security, and now we're talking about economics. And we recently had the Prime Minister who visited Washington and of course rolled out this mini purchasing package of American goods. So I think the Chinese will try to do the same, looking for ways to, assuage U.S. concerns, to narrow the deficit, to try and open up more market access. The Chinese want a bilateral investment treaty. The Trump administration is far less interested than the Obama administration, but are on the record as saying maybe we will get there. But in fact, the discussion in Washington is more about tightening up market investment access, particularly for China, but also for other countries through what we call our CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which may be broadened in the future. So I think, the one possible positive scenario is that if Xi Jinping in his second term after the party Congress really does want to implement economic reform, and he can use some of these demands from the United States to perhaps bolster a case for market reform. This is, of course, what happened when China was joining the WTO in the early 2000s. So that's the really positive scenario. But my guess is that this is going to continue to really be an area of friction in the U.S.-China relationship that the demands of Trump are just going to be too high for China to meet in the run-up to the 19th Party Congress. Xi Jinping will want to prevent this from getting out of control, but things could get pretty nasty, as I said, on this issue, on North Korea and South China Sea, I think after the 19th Party Congress later this year.
Perfect. Just think of the steel and aluminum and so forth, surpluses.
Yeah, the overcapacity issue.
In Hong, North Korea?
I think that since much of last year, especially since November of last year, when Trump had just been elected as U.S. president, and Xi Jinping has taken a serious and punitive actions against North Korea's nuclear and missile development, which China's previous leaders had not been willing or had not been dared to take, and especially China, and cut off and coal import to China. This means that the Chinese sanction, just like United States demanded, Trump demanded, that not limited on those direct activities and institutions of North Korea which directly relating to their nuclear and missile development, but also to expand to so-called normal, previously defined normal trade area. This is extraordinary. And this is mainly, and China had done, Xi Jinping had done under both pledges of North Korea, which and provocatively, increasingly, and developed their nuclear weapons and missiles, and also on the pledge of the United States, especially Trump administration. And China even and factually accept the Trump's principle of linkage, and for which China always, in fact, refused in the past. And this is represent what Xi has already done. And what will he further do? And this depends on whether Kim Jong-un launches 6 nuclear tests or some real intercontinental missile test. And if Kim Jong-un have done, in the future have done this, and China seems to have no choice, and then to cut off oil supply for a time span. But a critical question, and China asks itself, and we scholars ask Chinese government is that, and if China and cut off the oil on a relative permanent basis, whether it could achieve the objective, that is to force North Korea to have long time suspension of nuclear weapons or even surrender their nuclear weapons. And many people, including me, and inclined to believe it's not likely. And because Kim Jong-un have huge and stakes on further development of nuclear missiles, and also because he almost near to the breakthrough and to have, operational nuclear missiles. So the question is China's use its last major leverage against North Korea, but cannot achieve the objective of force North Korea to abandon or suspend for a long time. And so, what is the cost? You cannot achieve your purpose, but what is the cost? The possible cost is that North Korea could become China's permanent enemy. And also that if you take into this consideration that now China not only have a very historically very bad relation with North Korea, but also have quite a bad relationship with Republic of Korea. And this kind of situation, we have bad relationship with both North and South Korea, is some extraordinary phenomenon which happened for the first time at least since Deng Xiaoping established diplomatic relations in 1992 with South Korea. And also if China's cut off oil cannot or would not force North Korea to reverse their nuclear development, then the United States will continue to say that China is key. So China is the key. China will be the key, and almost forever if Pyongyang will not surrender. So I think that the geostrategic cost, and in terms of what I have just said, is quite prominent and far-reaching. So, and if you look at Xi Jinping's policy toward North Korea in the past 5 years, you can find one character. This is volatility. And sometimes he's very hard toward North Korea. Sometimes he can help to release his hard attitude to be changed to soft approach. Of course, this round, he had kept his hardness and toward North Korea almost, more than 1 year. This is extraordinary. But I cannot assure and whether in the future, and he considered China's geostrategic, interests and permanent interests, he would not change his attitude toward another direction. So I think that, and of course, Chinese government have not declared, but some very high Chinese government officials already in their articles to imply that time has run out. China will be a loser and whatever. And the issue is whether China can lose less than lose more in a long-term geostrategic situation in North Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. So you are keeping us all in suspension, clearly. Francois, please. Europe as actor.
In your question, you pointed an implicit dilemma, which I've tried to rephrase. If the US is playing its role, then Europe is more or less on the side, and it's hard to distinguish between European influence and what one might call Western or American influence. If the US goes off course, then there's a problem for Europe, who may have to retreat, to tiptoe into the shadow, to avoid being caught in the crossfire. And that's the price, of course, for not being a real federation. That's the price for being ambivalent about hard power, too. You might say that in those circumstances, Europe runs the risk of being, shall we say, ASEAN writ large. It would be an exaggeration because there is more EU than there is ASEAN among ourselves, as we know, in terms of integration. But to some extent, it's still true of external foreign policy. Let's look at the areas for compromise or possible cooperation. I was very skeptical about climate because this was the area where Obama and Xi agreed on a compromise that was not at all a European compromise. It was really, we'll go halfway, there will be no obligations. The main targets will be in 20 years, not now, or 18 years, pretty far away. So happens that the US actually did more under Obama, and that Xi Jinping started to do less, and suddenly this year he's doing more. But that's for his own reasons, so to speak, not because of an international commitment. And, Elizabeth Economy just published something this morning, repeating something I've tried to alert people to. China remains the biggest thermal coal plant exporter in the world, even as it cuts production there. But there are lots of other areas. One of them, for example, was non-proliferation. We managed to talk about Iran, and we managed to be the good cop in that circumstance with China, enticing it, but this was an example where we were on the side of the US. Another one is so-called connectivity, the thing that has replaced strategic relationships for the European Commission. They love those keywords between the Chinese and Europe, all the OBOR stuff. And in truth, there are things, and there is an interest in investment, for example, in Europe in infrastructures. The problem, as I see it, is up to now, China doesn't do a tenth of the efforts it goes towards countries such as Pakistan, Indonesia. Pakistan, $50 to $100 billion. In Europe, we're talking commercial loans to Eastern Europe. That's very different, at taxpayers' risk, not investment. It's something different, it's more commercial. In Indonesia, they agree to build a train, a fast train, and to undertake the risk by themselves, the financial risks. They don't in Europe. So we have to, and they complain about EU rules, they may be right on some of them, but in general they cannot treat Europe as if it was Africa in terms of what you do there. So that's an area where there's still room. The door is clearly still open, and there would be. I mean, in terms of soft power, the OBOR thing has been a wild success in Europe. I mean, I think beyond the dreams of China. Third area, Africa, stability, diverting some of the extraordinary funding that China has used in Africa to grab natural resources to sustainable development, cooperating with the Europeans who are trying to stabilize the situation, particularly in sub-Sahel countries. There is, in fact, an EU push to try and get some of that from the Chinese. And because this is not completely far from issues of counterterrorism, there is a chance there that China might relent, because counterterrorism is probably one of the areas, or the area, where it is most sensitive to international action. There is not much beyond that, and Bonnie mentioned the investment treaty, saying, China is pushing for it, and the US is so-so. It's interesting that with the EU, it's the situation in reverse. The EU has been trying to get one for years, and China hasn't been wildly interested, and even as we speak, it's not clear that it's more interested, whereas it does invest much in Europe. So there is even a likelihood that Europe would move closer to what Bonnie just described as more limits on investment, more guardrails, so to speak, in the absence of mutual trust. So it exists. We shouldn't, simplify things. A very big political risk for Washington, and this is something they should be alert to, is that antagonizing, maybe it's media show, maybe it's hype, maybe it's Twitter, but antagonizing Europeans repeatedly on a number of issues sort of risks wearing them down, and politics exist, apart from policies. So the US is running a risk, but we shall see. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Orville, is it a moving kind of tipping point?
Before I address that, let me just add a footnote to Xi Jinping's comment. Actually what China has to gain in the North Korea wager is, of course, better relations with the United States, which I think in many ways trump, if I may use that word, better relations with North or South Korea. You suggested, Bjorn, that I radiate a certain air of pessimism. I still believe in engagement, however, because there's no alternative. And I think I justify that with some sense that in the long game, it may not be, Xi Jinping may not be the final resting place, that, things go on. And I do fundamentally believe that, at some point China will continue to change, and it's not clear what its goal actually is, even though it may declare itself that the China dream is its goal, things as they are now, just getting a little bit better. So I would say that, we don't really know which way the world is going, but I suppose we who do live in the West do still like to imagine somehow that however frail our own democracies are, there's a certain virtue in them, and there is a certain sort of historical yearning for people to basically have more free and open lives. If you believe that, then you are an engager, whatever the cost, whatever the state of pessimism or optimism.
Having read your books, I mentioned with great interest on wealth and power. Of course, one thing that you say there very clearly is that when the Opium War occurred, this is also year one for China, because the idea of China's re-emergence and so forth, but also when the idea of humiliation is very much born, that is kept alive so very much. So, and now as you look at the current leadership, to realize this dream and so forth, and keeping humiliation alive, is that going to be the sort of paradoxical?
It's an interesting, another paradox, isn't it, that this country, which has been so startling successful in many ways, and you have to grant to China an amazing accomplishment I first went in 1975. If you had suggested to anyone at that point, Mao was still alive, the communes were still in effect, et cetera, that China would be where it is today in terms of economic development, they would have laughed at you. And yet, despite the success, the national narrative is one of victimization, humiliation, and having been preyed upon by superior Western predatory powers. The powers that today are kind of weak and toothless, Britain, France, et cetera. And it's so outdated. And yet it is one of the things which lies behind, I think, this fundamental inability of the party. And the party, believe me now, is leading China, not the government. It's the party. And its narrative is one of being under siege, being under attack, the Western powers are still, through their civil society, their churches, their government programs, trying to undermine their political system. And this isn't healthy. And it does not lead to better relations. And it does not lead to a climate where our officials can interact in a way where we're equals, because victims cannot be equal. And it's a psychological distortion that I think cries out to be remedied.
Thank you. Now we have 15 minutes to go and time for some questions. Please introduce yourself and a very brief question.
My name is Kjell Lundqvist from the Schiller Institute. Brief question. I don't agree with anybody on the panel, actually. François was closest. But the thing is that what China is doing, they are trying to end the era of geopolitics and build a new paradigm. And they are using the One Belt, One Road for that purpose. The closest supporter for that policy in the Western world just now is President Trump. That's why they like him, because he doesn't want a one-polar world. And the problem is that Europe and the establishment in the US doesn't like this, that he will have a policy on win-win cooperation and build the world. And do you really think that the liberal world order has created something good for humanity? Look at the Middle East, look at Africa and so on, and the history of China, of your last comments. As you know, China was destroyed by the British Empire. That was the intention. And that's why they are acting like they are doing now. And if then China offers an alternative, we should support them.
I think your question is quite clear.
Shouldn't
Please,
we support
Lars
them?
Fridén, next question. No, okay. Anybody else? Yeah, over there, please. Introduce yourself.
My name is Thomas Kapadia. I just want a quick question is, we've left a very important actor out of this, that's Russia. A very brief statement from the panel on China-Russia present relationship. Thank you.
Okay, China-Russia. Any further questions? Oh yeah, please.
My name is Eduardo. You seem, all of you, to be rather negative, and at the beginning, Mr. Lundgren said this, that...
Closer to the microphone, please.
Excuse me?
Closer, yeah.
Closer to the microphone.
My question is, if you look at the worst scenario, it's a hypothetical question, but if there were to be a conflict which led to war, what kind of a war would that be? In other words, what are the alternatives? I mean, especially you, Orwell, you seem to be extremely negative. That's the impression I get, and I would be very interested to hear what kind of a war that would be.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Closing comments from the panel, please. Who would like to start? Yeah.
China and Russia. I think one of the things that China and Russia normally don't get along very well. They have a long and rather complicated history. But the thing that brings them together now is their sense of common aggrievement. both view themselves as great powers who were preyed upon, picked apart, dismembered, and disesteemed and disrespected. And that is a kind of a very powerful bond, I think, which can't transcend every other interest, but it certainly keeps them together. What kind of a war could I imagine? You know, it's a terrifying thought. I would expect that if anything were to happen, it would, as some of my colleagues have suggested, be a rather accidental beginning, perhaps in the East China Sea. Professor Schur thinks that Japan and China may start getting together in a more friendly manner, which would be extremely welcome. But short of that, Japan is no joke. Their self-defense force is substantial. And the last time we had a war between China and Japan in the latter part of the 19th century, it set back relations and humiliated China to a degree it still hasn't gotten over. It would be a horrendous thing to see that happen again.
Okay.
Please, and then
I only talk about the current Sino-Russia relationship. And I think that the few years, several months ago, the situation is very clear, not complicated. And China was in a great, strategic rivalry with the United States. Russia was in a great confrontation with EU and the United States for the Ukraine. So the byproduct is that the China-Russia strategic relationship or semi-alliance are taken increasingly become more prominent.
It will
now, Trump. When Trump came, Russia disillusioned because the great rapprochement between Moscow and Washington have not been realized. And but Trump's relationship with Xi Jinping is quite good. So Russians are, of course, displeased, and especially for China, because of China's desire to have an okay relationship with Trump. So China take somewhat different, behavior and over issue of Syria, and different from Russians. This is extraordinary. And also in North Korea's problem. And there are some small but still detectable alienation between Moscow and Beijing on some issues. And if you look at intercourse between Xi and Xi Jinping, Xi and Putin, and in this month, they do not, in this month, repeat and publicly and prominently so-called the China-Russia comprehensive strategic partnership. So there's some change. But still, I think that whether for China, for Russia, for different reasons, and both sides are very reluctant to make this alienation become so prominent and even, become developed further. So I think that the China-Russia relationship and become more complicated than ever before. But still, both sides have some stake to maintain this relationship in a little lower level.
Bonnie, please. Thank you.
I'll address the other two questions. I think enough has been said about China-Russia relations. I think on the question of, is first the future of the liberal order, I think the question is whether China really wants to upend this world order and replace it with something else. And I think the Chinese themselves continue to state that they are not completely opposed to the liberal world order. They have gained a lot from it. There are specific things about the international order that they would like to change that are not advantageous to China. And we have seen that, for example, with the creation of the AIIB, when China's share and, for example, the IMF and World Bank were not approved by the US Congress, increasing that share. I don't see the Chinese as yet pushing for a fundamentally new world order. It's a very interesting question as to what kind of war the US and China would have. I agree to some extent with what Orville said, except that if you look at the East China Sea, that's where US statements have been crystal clear. So I think that miscalculation is less likely when you have a position that is clear. The United States sees Article 5 as applying to these disputed islands. The US will get involved. So I believe that the greatest source of possible war remains Taiwan. China's sovereignty concerns about Taiwan are far greater than its concerns about sovereignty over these, Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. The United States actually doesn't have a clear commitment to Taiwan's defense. If you read the Taiwan Relations Act, we are committed to selling defensive weapons to Taiwan. We have an obligation to maintain a military presence in the Western Pacific, but we do not have an obligation to come to Taiwan's defense. That said, we have a very clear, close relationship with Taiwan. If China, under Xi Jinping, were to make this a priority, if he decided that he was too impatient and wanted to reunify the country, I think that is the area where you have potential military conflict. It might be limited to the sea, potentially, but I think that's unlikely, because the factor that you have at play is that both sides believe that they can control escalation. And when you have that kind of what I see as false confidence, you have a greater risk of escalation. And we are dealing potentially with two nuclear powers. So you can have, this could escalate to strikes on US military bases, conventional in the region, in Japan, in Guam. You cannot rule out the potential for escalation to strikes on each other's homeland. These kind of scenarios are very dangerous, but I think that both sides think about them and prepare for them.
So you mean very serious, but...
Just ask a question before she finishes.
Yep.
Implicit in my question was not that it would only be a war between the U.S. and China. That it is, as you pointed out, there's Japan there. There is also the relationship between some of the ASEAN countries as well. In looking at it at a distance of 10, 15, 20 years. Once China's in, they don't, a little bit like what happened in Vietnam, they don't go out that quickly. And that's what, as I say, it was not only the question of just the U.S.
I doubt that other countries would get involved in this war. There is to some extent, the willingness of Japan to become involved, supplying, for example, logistical support, in part because we have our bases there, or using hospitals in Japan. They now have, because they've reinterpreted their constitution, the potential at least to do that. But I believe that virtually every country in the region would want to keep its head down.
Can I?
Very briefly, yeah.
I think that in the past, China has had a military conflict with Vietnam, has had a military conflict with the Philippines, but the United States have not military involved because these two countries do not touch on U.S. value interests. But if China conflict with Japan, conflict with, some South Korea, for example, this is a different matter.
Couple of final wise words from Francois.
To me, it's evident that the U.S. has been doing everything in its power to avoid a conflict. That was true and openly said about the Obama administration. It was even reproached that that's also what made the advances by China possible. But it seems to be true also, as far as we go, and with the limit that that I discussed about predictability, seems to be true about the Trump administration. A war, I think, would be the most devastating conflict, even if it stays conventional, that we have seen, given the means in presence. And I think it would devastate the world's economy in different ways as well. It would really be a turning point. And also it would set back China economically, but also politically, everything that we have discussed, and especially what Orville has discussed, was coalesce into another 50 years of rigid and paranoid nationalism after such a conflict. This is something, by the way, when you go to Japan, in spite of the hostility that's now prevalent about China because of all that has happened, there is this underlying fear in Japan to kind of harden and render infinite Chinese nationalism. So that's also, counseling caution on the part of Chinese partners of China.
But the risk, 30 seconds.
But the risk, of course, is that China tiptoes around red lines thanks to that caution.
I would like to make a very short supplement to what Professor Xiao once talk about. I think that this is very important for current Chinese political culture. And in the past 5 years, an emphasis of Chinese Communist Party's public education is not bring back to so-called the days and years of humiliation. The emphasis is on great. Before that, great past, Chinese national, in Tang Dynasty, in Qing Dynasty, China is so great, and so we should to restore this kind of national great resurgence. So mentality of victim, I think that is not, the major points of China's popular nation now. The major points is China's great past.
Right. Clearly so. If I were to summarize discussion, its an underlying theme, it would be strategic distrust will remain there as an inevitable fact. A big hand to the panel.